Happy Tuesday, NCAA men's fans. It is that time. We are down to 4. Fantastic weekend of the Sweet 16. We're going to be talking about a lot of things. One of the things we'll talk about later is the coaching carousel. It's already been done. Some prime jobs sucked up there. Of course, Jim will have his stumpy out for the trivial and tidbits as we go. We'll also be talking about this weekend's games and a lot of other things. But first, we're going to reflect back on the Sweet 16 that it was. Before we get to that, we will, of course, introduce ourselves as the Trogs, the two really old guys talking basketball. I'm Jeff Zink, and, of course, as always, I welcome my good friend Jim Reaker to the program.
Good morning, Jeff. Actually, we're a little late today, aren't we? It's afternoon already, but it's a great day, and the season's winding down, and the craziness continued last weekend, didn't it?
It did, and by this time next week, we'll know. You talk about Fat Tuesday being the start of Lent. It'll be a Fat Tuesday for whoever is on top of the heap when we do our Trogcast next week. But it was an exciting game of basketball. To be honest with you, Jim, I don't know that I can say it was totally good basketball because a couple of those games were pretty darn ugly, but it was very exciting. Before we get into those, we'll just remind people that Jim and I are not the best pickers in the world. We'll reflect back. Jim had Wisconsin, North Carolina, Kansas, and Xavier going into the Final Four. I had Baylor, UCLA, Kansas, and Arizona. Of course, everybody knows that it's South Carolina, North Carolina, Oregon, and Gonzaga. So between us, we got 1 out of 8 picks right. So
and I win.
Well, you can look at it that way as you won, but let's start this way. Let's talk about how they got there, and we'll start by letting you talk about all the teams from the conferences you've covered from this year. Go.
All right. Well, first of all, the most exciting game of the weekend or the
Wait a minute. You go right into exciting games. None of the guys from your conferences got in the Final Four.
Oh, I thought you wanted to talk about the ones that played this weekend.
Yeah, well, we can do that too, but you have to admit, you may have picked the one Final Four in, but my conferences came through. So I'll let you go now. I just had to get that tweak in since you're claiming a win.
Okay, I get you now. Now, I was just going to say, you know what I was going to say. The most exciting game of the 4 days for me was late Thursday night, but I was there for every minute of it when the Xavier Musketeers made it to the Elite Eight for the third time in school history, and we just couldn't take that next step yet. But, of course, we'll be talking a lot about this on Thursday in the Razorcast. We'll be looking forward to the future. The future is bright. The glass is more than half full. The Muskies will be back. And Butler, they showed up against UNC, but as we kind of predicted, UNC took them out. And, of course, I got to be kind of a UC or UNC fan, North Carolina fan, because they're the ones that helped me win the competition with coming through. The only one that either one of us picked that made it to the Final Four. Big Ten, Wisconsin. That was kind of a surprise that Florida took them out. I thought their experience would carry them further. I was kind of optimistic about Purdue, but I had kind of backed off of them. I thought Kansas would take care of them. And, of course, Kansas one of mine too, and that was probably the biggest surprise maybe of the whole weekend, how Oregon took them out. So did I miss any of mine? I think that's all. Oh, Baylor, I don't know. I didn't expect Baylor. I think they're too new to the whole Sweet 16. They'll get there someday. Drew's building a good program down there, but they keep showing up in that Sweet 16. They're gonna knock the door down someday. But Baylor, I think, had kind of lost some steam here near the end of the year. Yeah, you got the SEC. That's actually the only one you got in, isn't it? Oh no, the ACC.
SEC, the ACC, the Pac-12, and I also covered the West Coast Conference. I've got all 4 teams in there, my man.
Yeah. That was
you say now that you were happy to jump to say, hey, you won. Now you're backtracking. To go in there, I mean, it's great the way they go. But this was what was exciting about it. And if we go through the 4 and how they got there, I mean, Oregon, I don't know if you got a chance at that, but one of the most exciting games was that Oregon-Michigan game. Again, going down to the last shot, Michigan is catching the front rim, and then they embarrassed Kansas. It makes you think, did did Kansas take Oregon maybe a little too lightly? Kansas, they've got Boucher hurt, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, whether or not that's sort of been their spark, one of their big stars. But, Dylan Brooks, I mean, when we go back and reflect upon when we picked our coaches of the year and the players of the year, I think we did pretty good there because my pick was Dylan Brooks, who put that Oregon team on his back, and they're responding to his leadership. That's one of the reasons I picked him was for that. And I think maybe Kansas overlooked him. Kansas was just winning by such big margins that after they took out Purdue, maybe they just took the pedal off of the gas a little bit. But the nice thing was all of these games were, except for one or two, were pretty close games. So you also look at, like you said, North Carolina. I mean, they overwhelmed Butler. That was one that wasn't close, and you think that Warren Williams got them. And then, again, it comes down to them needing a shot going in with 0.3 seconds, 0.3 seconds by Luke May to get past Kentucky. And, again, then the storyline might be Kentucky, they sort of overwhelmed UCLA in the second half, but a lot of people were touting that as, a Final Four or a championship-type game. So maybe that. At South Carolina, again, they throttled Baylor. Baylor, I'm with you, just ran out of gas. And then what I think was probably the best game after Florida, just slipped past Wisconsin there, was that South Carolina-Florida game. Again, back and forth, right down to it. They knew each other from their leagues. I picked Mike White as the coach of the year there in the SEC for what he did. And then you got Gonzaga, who pushed past West Virginia and then manhandled Xavier. And Xavier, their emotions getting to the Elite Eight might have just caught the rest of them, especially beating former coach Sean Miller in Arizona, going down. They were down, 8 with 2 minutes left. And then Gonzaga coming back against West Virginia. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but the end of that game might just have been the ugliest end of a tournament game that I've ever seen. But, again, that's sort of how we got there. Before we move forward, any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That West Virginia game, if I recall, they didn't even get a shot up, did they?
No, and they didn't need a 3 was the thing. They were down 2, so a basket. I mean, and I don't think Bobby Huggins minds going into overtime the way he'll wear another team down. And it was just to me that was the ugliest game of the tournament. But that's not surprising when you've got two teams like Gonzaga and West Virginia that are so good on defense. I think West Virginia only ended up shooting 28% from the field, but it still went down to the last shot. Just amazing. Any other thoughts from any of the other Sweet 16 or Elite 8 games before we get into what's going to be going on in Glendale?
We might get into this a little bit later, but UNC, that shot right after against UK, Monk had just hit a 3 to tie the game, and he'd kind of been off, and then UNC comes right back, and the young man, it was Luke May is his name, right?
Luke May. Mm-hmm.
And he's really kind of, I think his story, I'd like to read more about it, but what I did, I think he was a walk-on originally and kind of had worked his way into a scholarship player and still wasn't a superstar, kind of a role player. But that's what's so great about the NCAA, because I'll ask you this question because you say this all the time when certain situations like this happen, but will Luke May ever have to buy a drink again in Chapel Hill, North Carolina?
The neatest thing, and I'm sure you saw it, I don't know because you've been pretty busy with yourself if you're coming back, I don't know if you saw it, but they finished that game on Sunday. They were the second game Sunday. Luke May was at his 8 o'clock class on Monday morning.
I heard that story, and I heard that the professor told the class to give him a standing ovation the new Tar Heel legend or something like that.
Well, that's all. And for them, people forget sometimes. I mean, they had their hearts broken by that last second shot by Villanova in the final last year. So they've got that. Maybe they've got the mojo going. But any one of those three teams we mentioned, UCLA, Kentucky, North Carolina, could have been deadly out of that region. A couple of the things that I've written down there, maybe Kansas took Oregon or Oregon just responded to the fact that they've lost Chris Boucher, making them even stronger. But also, this storyline, we've talked before. We split up the 6 conferences. We talked about the West Coast Conference, the Atlantic 10, the other ones that are in there. Does the fact that Gonzaga and Xavier got to where they were, as well as Butler where they were, does it just prove that the mid-majors belong? Especially when the SEC had an all SEC regional final and had another team in a regional final, and they were considered to be having a down year. I think it's just indicative of this year, Jim, of how it's gone, and that's when we start to talk about what's going to happen here in Phoenix. This is the year of you just never know.
Oh yeah, that's the story here, because the whole season's been crazy. And actually, remember we talked about the first weekend was almost a little bit too calm, what we expected, but it got crazy. But I'm going to correct you a little bit here. I'm not calling Butler, Xavier, and Gonzaga mid-majors anymore. They're power players in college basketball. So I know Gonzaga's still not in one of the major conferences, and again, that's probably a discussion for another day. We've talked a little bit about that. Where do they go next? Can the West Coast Conference meet their needs now? But Butler and Xavier, they're in the Big East, of course, and you know how I feel about that. Even though it's not a football conference, not one of the Power 5, they're part of the Power 6 basketball. So don't call them mid-majors anymore.
Well, you don't do that, but you still, as we'll talk about it does become a factor, and things have changed a little bit. You're right, in the Big East. But you even look at, somebody like Dana Altman, who knew his team was going to the Big East but chose to go from Creighton to Oregon anyway. We'll talk about that when we talk about the coaches and what that might mean, especially as we talk a little bit later about Archie Miller's move to Indiana and all that involves. But let's go ahead and turn our eyes toward Phoenix. A couple of things that people who are sports-minded probably know, but we'll go over it before we talk about the matchups. This is the first time 2 West Coast teams have ever been in the Final Four together. And the last West Coast Conference team in the Final Four was San Francisco back in 1956. That was the Bill Russell, Casey Jones team. This is my favorite. Even though Gonzaga is in there for the first time and South Carolina is getting there for the first time, Oregon is back for the first time since winning the inaugural tournament in 1939. So they've waited almost 80 years to get back to what they claimed for themselves first. And as you did in one of your trivias, they're called the Webfoots back then. They weren't even called the Ducks yet. Gonzaga, like I say, first time in 21 tournament appearances, 18 of those under Mark Few. And Mark Few, of course, finally breaks through to the Final Four in a year where he became the 3rd fastest coach to 500 wins. And the first trip for South Carolina ever, and what's neat about that is it's Frank Martin's first trip to the Final Four, and his first trip to the NCAA with South Carolina. And you may recall, because I know you followed Frank Martin as he went from Cincy to Kansas State over, he had a devastating upset in the regional finals by Butler in 2010, after a 2-overtime win against Xavier in the Sweet 16 while he was at Kansas State. And you got to think, he just missed playing his mentor, Bob Huggins, because that's who he would have been matched up with if West Virginia had made it. Of course, you got Roy Williams. That's the one blue bed group coming in. He's trying for his 3rd championship. And so we already mentioned coming back from the heartbreaking loss of last year's final. And this is a guy, this is his 9th trip to the Final Four. He's got 2 championships, 3 runner-ups, and lost twice in the semis. And the 3rd win would tie him with Bobby Knight and Jim Calhoun with 3. And there's only 3 other coaches that have more. Adolph Rupp with 4, Coach K with 5, and John Wooden with 10. And the other thing is to look back. It's the last time a team lost the final in the previous year and came back to win was Kentucky in 1998, almost 20 years ago. And it's only been done 3 times total. So, is it going to be Roy Williams getting his 3rd? Is it going to be Mark Few, Frank Martin, or Dana Altman getting his 1st? So as we go through that, I'll let you just talk about, whatever you're thinking about in these matchups, which right now is going to be South Carolina versus Gonzaga, and then North Carolina versus Oregon.
Well, I think there's just a great story no matter what happens, and that's what's so exciting about this Final Four. Actually, just to make a point, I think, and I believe it was the South region, the one with UCLA, Kentucky, and North Carolina, that actually could have been a Final Four with Butler thrown in there. But this one has so many great storylines. And actually, I think if I had to choose, I like the South Carolina Frank Martin story. Here's a guy that didn't even play college basketball. He was a high school PE teacher and a JV coach for like 8 years, and then they finally gave him the head coaching position, and he just went off, just a lot of it was luck, I think, being in the right place at the right time, but a lot of it, I think, was just hard work and putting your nose to the grindstone and doing everything at whatever level you are and making it to the next level. Interesting question you ask is, would he have liked to play against Bob Huggins? I would say probably not, because I just saw an interview with him yesterday where he talked about one of the people special to him was Bob Huggins, because when Bob Huggins left after that first year at Kansas State and they turned it over to Frank Martin, and I didn't even know this, Bob Huggins took none of the assistant coaches with him to West Virginia. And Frank Martin said he could have, and they all would have gone with him. But Bob Huggins was big enough to say, no, Frank, first year doing this, he needs all these assistants. I'll go to West Virginia. I'll hire new assistants. I'll be fine. And he thanked Bob Huggins. He said Bob Huggins is one of the most important persons in his life to get him to where he is. But, yeah, I just think that's a great story. Here's a hard-nosed guy. I think he's actually a Cuban-American. I'm not sure if he's born in Cuba and came here, but I think his parents were born in Cuba. So just a great American story of somebody coming here and working hard, and now look at this. He's never played in a college basketball game, but he's coaching in the Final Four. So for me, if South Carolina would win it all, I think that's a great story. I think Gonzaga winning it all is a great story. Mark Few, yeah, what a great guy. I mean, this another one, a guy who, has labored out there on the West Coast with mid-major program and just keeps churning and breaking down the next door and breaking down the next door. And, even if they don't win it all, getting to the Final Four is the next step. And, he's just a guy that he loves where he is, and he represents that university well. The Oregon story, yeah, that's great. First one, and now it's been so long, and that would be a great story. And again, I think they might be playing off the emotion of losing Boucher. I think, sometimes losing a major player for teams, sometimes it draws them closer together, kind of like, we can talk about Xavier in that vein. We won't that much today, but, that whole story with Edmund Sumner and how they played off of that. And here's another great story, I think. And again, the North Carolina, yeah, the heartbreaking loss last year, and I have read a few things that they have used that from day one, the very next day after last year. That has been in their mind, and they wanted to get back, and they wanted to make amends for that. And sometimes that devastating, sickening feeling of losing a national championship like that can motivate you. So there's all these great stories. And here's another one you didn't even mention. What if it's North Carolina versus South Carolina? What a story that would be. So, yeah.
Well, Go ahead.
Go ahead. I just was going to say that, there's just so many stories here that it's going to be an exciting weekend. And again, I like sometimes more the personal side of the games rather than the X and O's. Being a coach, we know that the psychology and all that is sometimes more important. And of course, it makes for great 30 for 30s on ESPN 20 years later.
Well, I didn't mention that, but I do have in our outline for today, which matchup in the final do you think would be the most intriguing? We've done a little bit, whether it's the All-Carolina matchup, the battle of the one seeds, which would be Gonzaga versus North Carolina, the All-West matchup, which would be Gonzaga versus Oregon, or the Who the Funk It, South Carolina versus Oregon. But first, let's talk about the two games. We've got Gonzaga going up against South Carolina. And the word of that game is going to have to be defense. Even though Gonzaga is beating people by 22 points a game on the average, probably a lot of people don't realize that they are the number one defense in the country. And South Carolina, of course, has gotten where they are with their defense. So I'm with you. I like the human interest stories, and we'll get to our picks in a little bit and how that will go. And And when I get to there, it's going to be, heart versus head. And that happens every year, even when you're picking your bracket. But right now, let's focus on that game. And, who do you like coming out of that game, Gonzaga or South Carolina?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've seen Gonzaga play more than South Carolina. I know that defense is the key, but I'll make the head choice. I think overall Gonzaga is a much better team, and I think if it comes down to that, they're going to win it. But again, if I was picking with my heart of the story, I'd like to see I think I'd like to see Frank Martin and the Gamecocks make it to the final game. But I'm going to pick Gonzaga to win that one.
And that's, when you look at the seedings and everything, we've got to remember that we have 3 teams in the Final Four that were ranked at number 1 for at one time or another. Oregon just for a week, but Gonzaga for multiple weeks, and North Carolina for a couple of weeks there. So the pundits got it right there. It is going to come down to it, and like Nigel Williams-Goss was the star of Gonzaga. He says, they've got to avoid live ball turnovers, and if they can do that, meaning that their passes and throwing the balls out of bounds, not allowing a steal or things like that, and it's going to come down to that. But I think, when we're looking at the stars, Williams-Goss is the pedal that runs that team, but also Karnowski in the middle. And I don't know that South Carolina has an answer to that. They do have an answer in their star. The kid that I picked for the All-SEC Player of the Year, and one of the greatest names in the tournament, Sindarius Thornwell, who's got his own story coming back from a suspension. And, much like Dylan Brooks, they leave that team. But I just think in the end, every time somebody has challenged Gonzaga, and we haven't given them the due they thought, because of that West Coast Conference, they've answered it. Even, I don't know if you were watching the West Virginia game, but West Virginia had them down by 6 or 7 at one point, and Mark Few didn't blink. He knew his team could get back in. He made some adjustments, and they ended up coming back on West Virginia. And that 6 or 7 lead was only with like 3.5 minutes left. So I'm with you. I'm going to go with Mark Few and Gonzaga, but I'm also with you in that my heart, in part because of the story, one of the few Hispanic coaches in the NCAA, and Frank Martin, and of course his time here in Cincinnati at my alma mater, one of my alma maters at Cincinnati, University of Cincinnati, leads me that way. But I'm with you. It's going to be an interesting time on Saturday, and sometimes the semifinals are more exciting than the final game they have been in the past. So any more thoughts on Gonzaga, South Carolina before we move across the bracket to North Carolina and Oregon?
Nope, that kind of sums up my thoughts.
Okay, so let's go on. We've got, like I say, the battle over there, Oregon being led by Dylan Brooks, and we've got UNC with Jackson in May, and Coach Williams, who's been there before, versus Dana Altman, who's there for the first time. But an Oregon team that just hasn't said die, and again took out a Kansas team that seemed to be steamrolling to the title. In fact, Kansas was the team that I had in my bracket going all the way. But like I said earlier, I'm not very good at that because absolutely none of the teams in my bracket made the Final Four. But what do you see going on there? Oregon in the upset over Kansas and quite handily versus North Carolina, who needed a last-second shot just to get past Kentucky.
Well, again, I'm going to have to go with, if you're picking from the head, I think it's North Carolina. Factors there. Roy Williams has been there before. Plus, North Carolina's got all kinds of stars. Yeah, Oregon, and I'm not sure what's driving them right now, if it is the loss of Boucher, but I think, sometimes when you get this far, and here's the thing, too, North Carolina had their scare earlier against Arkansas. And it seems like in your 6 games, if you win a national championship, one of them is going to be close, and one of them you're going to have to get a little bit lucky. And I think that's they've already passed that. And if Joel Berry plays like he can play and he runs the show, I just don't think Oregon can beat him. And I don't think anybody, maybe, really, if you want to see a good basketball game, though, it'd be North Carolina, I think, and Gonzaga. I think those would truly be probably the two best teams in the country. Of course, you could talk about a little bit about Kansas, Kentucky, and Duke maybe being up there. But obviously, I think going in this tournament, they are definitely two of the top five, whereas Oregon and South Carolina probably, maybe Oregon, but wouldn't have been put in that case. So I'm definitely going with North Carolina. Again, the Oregon story would be good. And another class act, Dana Altman, it would be great for him to get there and do that. But as a betting man, I'm going with the Tar Heels.
You bring up a very good point, which we haven't touched on that, and those are the fragile ankles of Barry. And even Coach Williams is saying, or he could be doing a little Lou Holtz there, and saying, oh well, maybe he's not going to be ready, and letting the other team try to go in a different direction. But I can tell you this: if you give Roy Williams basically a week to prepare for one team, he's going to be ready. And it's going to be very hard to defeat a North Carolina team that's prepared, especially with the staff that he has. So, I'd like to disagree with you, but I can't. I think it is going to be the two number one seeds in the final game. They just got a little bit too much, but don't be surprised with Oregon. I mean, they've surprised people before, especially coming down the stretch there. But you just never know what's going to happen when you get into these situations. Which leads us to now that we know that we're kind of going with the battle of the number ones. It helps us reflect back on who's going to be the difference makers this weekend. And what's a little bit ironic about it is we spoke a couple of times this season about it being the year of the freshmen, yet the people that are popping up to really lead the charge are the upperclassmen. When you look at the stars that have prevailed, Jackson is a junior, Barry's a junior, Dylan Brooks is a junior, Nigel Williams-Goss is a junior, Sindarius Thornwell is a senior, and that's who have gotten these teams in terms of leadership to where they are. Nothing against the one-and-doners, nothing against the freshmen who, nobody's going to take away Malik Monk's shot there at the end of the Kentucky UNC game, which they all probably thought had won them the game, and he played like a champion. But will it be those team stars, or are we going to see somebody else like the difference of Karnowski or one of these bench players or one of the other freshmen we haven't talked about come out and make a difference on Saturday and Monday?
Well, that's why we watch the game, because again, anything that happens in this Final Four, especially if it happens in the final game, again, will turn into lore and legend. And like Luke May, again, somebody like that could step up and just have to take the last shot because the ball's in their hands, and like he did there against UK. So that's what's fun about it. One comment about, I like the fact, sorry, but I'm not a big one-and-done fan. Again, I understand why they do it. Be a good discussion for someday. I'm not quite sure about the schools that really embrace it or why they embrace it, or I don't know. There's a lot of things there. But what makes it special to me is this is why I like college basketball maybe more than the NBA, because, the NBA obviously is a much more polished, refined product. It is a professional product. But I like the human side of it. Some of these guys who do spend 4 years at these schools, and they get better every year, and they contribute however they can contribute, and then they go on. They may not even play professional, although a lot of them obviously go around the world, different places, even if they don't play in the NBA, but maybe are successful in life because of the 4 years that they went through at some institution where they learned how to deal with adversity and contribute their part and be a role player. So that's why I find college basketball one of the most exciting. This Final Four weekend I think is right up there with the Super Bowl, the World Series, and I think still has something over the NBA. Yeah, the NBA is kind of fun to watch when the real good teams start playing in the playoffs, and the LeBrons and the Durants and the Westbrooks and all those start playing and do the magnificent things. But still, college basketball isn't quite what it used to be with this one and done that's come around. But still, I like the fact that the one and dones don't. Even though you have the best talent, you're not always the best team.
And that is the key. It's going to be team, and that's what comes around. I'm with you on a lot of those sentiments, but the game has changed. So now we both have Gonzaga and North Carolina in the final game on Monday. Who's celebrating on Tuesday morning?
I got to go with North Carolina. Factors, coaching experience, and just experience. Again, they were there. They were in the same place last year. Gonzaga, it's going to be a new experience. The whole Final Four is going to be a new experience for them. They're a very, very good team, but I think we have to give the advantage to the Tar Heels just because, again, just having been there last year, that it's going to be more business for them when they, that first game, they know they got to win that first game and take care of business and get to the second game. Whereas Gonzaga, again, a little more hoopla, I think probably first time there, exciting. Fans are going to be excited. Players are going to be excited. There's going to be probably a little bit more distractions. Probably talent-wise, they're probably pretty evenly matched. But, again, with the experience, I got to go with the Tar Heels.
And I hear you, but just for argument's sake, I'm going to go with the Zags. I think the Bulldogs come out. I'd love to see Mark Few get his first. Wouldn't mind Roy Williams getting his third. He had those tough years at Kansas where he's never able to quite get there. Just like to see somebody new. That's me. I'm usually with the underdogs, and I'll do it this time. I usually like to see somebody who hasn't won it before win it, and that's more of a heart choice than a head choice. But I still think Gonzaga. I mean, they've been number one most of the year, and that defense makes a difference. Well, let's go on to what's starting to be on everybody's minds now, and that's the coaching carousel. We were pretty good at picking players of the year, and we were very good at picking coaches on the hot seat. Almost everybody that we mentioned in our podcast a couple of weeks ago has lost his job. Lorenzo Ramar at Washington, Johnny Jones at LSU, and Anderson at Missouri, and Gottfried had already lost his job in the ACC for me, and then neither of us thought he'd lose the job in the Big East, but it did come to happen with John Thompson III losing his at Georgetown. Tom Crean, who you talked about several times at Indiana, and you really didn't have too many people on the hot seat there in the Big 12 with Brad Underwood, who had a good year at Oklahoma State, decided to move to Illinois. So now when we look at it, there have been some moves already, and you got to stop and think, who's made the best move so far? Archie Miller's move from Dayton to Indiana. Mike Hopkins, who was considered the heir apparent of Jim Boeheim in Syracuse, has taken Ramar's old Washington job. And you got to wonder, does this mean that Jim Boeheim said, he's going to be around for many more years, so Hopkins decided to take it? Or they say they have a conversation that said, hey, I'm going to leave in a couple of years. Why don't you go get some head coaching experience, and then we'll bring you back, and then you don't need to have a Greg Gard or Bill Gunther situation like they had at Wisconsin or at North Carolina. Quanzo Martin was a curious move from California to Mizzou. To me, that was a kind of a lateral move more than anything else. And then Brad Underwood, as I just mentioned, moved from Oklahoma State to Illinois. So, I mean, you've had a chance to look at it. There might be somebody else, but what's been the most intriguing hire or the best move so far?
You asked me two questions there. First of all, a little clarification. Quanzo Martin, he played at Purdue, didn't he? Or am I mistaken? I think that's probably what that move's about, more back to the Midwest. Yeah, it is a lateral move, but I think he probably wasn't a left coast guy, if I'm thinking of the right guy there. The one that has the most intrigue is probably the best move for the coach. Not quite. I think it makes clear maybe what was said is the Archie Miller move. I remember that A.D. Glass said he wanted an Indiana boy, and Archie Miller has nothing to do with Indiana. I think the Millers grew up in Pennsylvania, and he's been a lot of different places, but I don't know his association besides being probably a half hour from the Indiana-Ohio border. I guess he does have some recruiting inroads over into Indiana. That's kind of intriguing to me. I think it's a great move for Archie. Here, being a Hoosier, you know what I want to say, though? Why, you guys, I don't know. They just, to me, sometimes make moves I don't quite understand. I hope Archie's successful, but this might be too big of a job for him. And he's done very well at Dayton. I mean, he's carried that program, and they've started to almost replace Xavier as the flagship of the A-10. But I just think, and no disrespect to Archie Miller, I just think that the Hoosier, this is probably one of the top 5, definitely 10 jobs in the country as far as tradition and fan base. I just think the Hoosiers could have taken a little bit more time and gotten somebody that might be prepared. I just, all the way back to Sampson and Crean. I mean, they were good coaches. I felt like they just, it's like they're afraid they're going to miss out, or they're going to end up with nobody. They don't take their time. Again, that's just personal thoughts, and I thought that was a surprise to me. And again, all the luck in the world to Archie Miller. Again, hopefully he'll bring Indiana back to what it was. I'm not really a big Hoosier fan. Growing up in the northern part of the state, I actually grew up an Irish fan. But basketball's better if IU is one of the top teams in the Big Ten and ultimately one of the top teams in the country. College basketball is better for that. The other jobs, not really any much surprises there, but the intrigue is the Georgetown job. I think that's somebody they could turn that around real quick. There's lots of resources there. There's a tradition there. So that's going to be the one I'm going to watch the most. Of course, I'm going to watch it the most because they're going to be competing against the Musketeers in the Big East next year. So I think somebody coming in there could get those ducks in a row really, really quick, and Georgetown could be a major player again really, really soon. I think the one name I've heard mentioned, which is kind of an interesting name because he has absolutely no coaching experience, is Patrick Ewing, kind of going with the Chris Mullen model at St. John's. Bring in an icon, and if he puts enough good people around him that know the basketball side of it, obviously knows the basketball side of it, but he's never been a coach, maybe that would be a quick turnaround. It'd obviously sell seats for a while probably if Patrick Ewing was on the sideline.
Well, I got a few thoughts on what you said. First of all, I don't bleed Indiana red like you do, so I think I can see it from a slightly different kaleidoscope. I think Archie Miller is an inspired hire for IU. Archie has been pursued for several years here and has had his pick. The rumor out there was he was waiting to see what his old mentor, Thad Matta, was going to do at Ohio State. And, of course, he went to North Carolina State, and that job was open. But he wanted to go someplace where, he knew that things were set up properly. So obviously that is probably a sign as Ohio State announced that Thad Matta is coming back even with his health issues. And Thad Matta, he's still a relatively young man. He's only in his late 40s or early 50s that I remember. And you look at the coaches that are in the Final Four, they're kind of in there. The nice thing about Archie, come on, I mean, this is a guy that took Dayton to the Elite Eight just a few years ago and has had his team in there for 4 straight years. I think a couple of phone calls that he would want to make would be to somebody like Dana Altman, who left the Missouri Valley Conference when Creighton was in it and went to Oregon and what that steps up. Of course, he's already talked to his brother, Sean, about moving up to a larger conference from Xavier to when it wasn't in the Big East, when it was still in the old NCC or the conference that they were in there. And then, but another person I think you want to pick up the phone with is Shaka Smart, who left VCU and went to Texas, and that hasn't exactly worked out the way he wanted it to. And some people are rumoring Shaka Smart for that Georgetown position, to come back into the Virginia area that he knew so well. My thoughts on them wanting an Indiana fan, I think that was A.D. Glass coming and saying, please come home, Steve Alford, but he's very happy in UCLA. Took them to the Sweet 16. You got to remember Coach Wooden went from Indiana out to L.A., and this hire somebody from inside doesn't always work. I mean, Roy Williams came home to North Carolina, and other people have too, but sometimes they have success elsewhere. I mean, Matt Doherty didn't exactly work at North Carolina, and Jim Farmer didn't work at UCLA, and to go locally, Tony Yates, who was a great here at Cincinnati, was a major disaster. So, looking for somebody that's Hoosier red doesn't always work out. And then before I give it back to you, I'll just say on the Patrick Ewing front, that might be a nice bridge to appease Daddy Thompson. The thing that I would work at, and I agree with you, it's kind of like a Mullen move, and I think Chris Mullen's going to make some hay here at St. John's in the next couple of years as he gets more of those scrappy New York kids on his bench. But Patrick Ewing has never been a head coach, and he's never been a college coach. And I've got to wonder the difference between being a longtime assistant in the NBA versus going straight into that. What would happen? We never got a chance to go back and talk about how Mike Dunleavy's doing at Tulane and how Avery Johnson, who had a good year at Alabama, are doing, and some of those coaches that came from the NBA into there are doing. But I'm with you right now. Georgetown would probably be the most attractive offer, but I think the one to watch as well is going to be Mike Hopkins going to Washington, because they've got some talent there. Lorenzo Rimar wasn't able to do it. Of course, he's going to lose Folk to the draft. But is he going to go and then say make his name at Washington and stay there, or when Jimbe Ayan leaves, will he head back to Syracuse? And just a fact check, you are right, Quanzo Martin did go to Purdue, so maybe that's part of it, to come back into that area. But also I think, Cal's often had that reputation for very stringent academic issues, and that might be part of it too. Who knows?
All right, so I'm going to tell you how this is so you understand, because you'll never understand because you didn't live there. But here's basically what it is. And I'm going to be a little bit facetious here, but a part of it is, I think, very, very true. There's probably some Hoosiers out there listening to us right now that will agree with me. The belief in Indiana is if you didn't grow up in Indiana, you really don't know how to play basketball. You really don't know how to coach basketball. And that's what Archie Miller may be the greatest coach in the world, but there's certain people that he's going to really have to win over because he is an outsider. I'll tell you a couple real quick stories that'll lead you to this. When I was in second grade, I remember one day, second grade teacher started a discussion, said, was just talking about what areas of the country were known for, And she said, well, what's Indiana known for? It's the best in the world. And we're all looking at her like, I don't know, we're guessing all these different things. She said basketball. Everybody knows the best basketball is played in Indiana. And we're like, oh, really? I didn't realize that at the time. Obviously, gone to a lot of basketball games, but at that age just figured that happened everywhere. But here's another story that, again, we think we play at the best. We think we coach at the best. Yeah, they play pretty good down in the Carolinas. Yeah, there's some kids that have come out of New York City that have been great players. And back when I was in college, me and a couple buddies were making a road trip to Philadelphia, and we're getting ready to go for the weekend, kind of a quick thrown-together road trip. And we're all set, ready to go, packed, started to leave, and one of my buddies says, whoa, I forgot something. And so he jumps out of the car, and he runs in the house, and he comes running back out with his basketball. And he threw the basketball in the back seat, and he says, you never know, we might have to teach somebody how to play out in Philadelphia. Again, I'm just telling you that a lot of people believe if you're not from Indiana, you don't really know everything about the game. And I think then there's a lot of old people there that, you know what I'm saying, they're sitting there right now going, Yeah, he's right. So, again, I wish him all the luck, but I just being a Hoosier, I thought they would have, even Thad Matta, coached at Butler, although he's actually originally from Illinois. He has more of an Indiana connection than Archie Miller. But, again, we'll see how it all plays out.
Well, and that's why I can look at it with different eyes. I tell you, let me say this to all of your friends in Indiana and around, and they can put their post. Bobby Knight is not walking back through that door. And, of course, he had to put his foot in his mouth a couple weeks ago by saying, he wished all the people that were in the administration there were dead, which he knows exactly who's there and who's not anymore. I wish he would get over it and come back because the IU folks would love to log in. But, even before that, when you look at that, Bobby Knight was an Ohio State man. And a lot of people got on him about going to Indiana, and he turned it into his own. And I think Archie Miller can do that. You're right. You got all that baggage with you. But since Knight left at the end of the 2000 season, I mean, you're talking, 18 years now and 10 NCAA tournament appearances, but one Final Four. I mean, I agree. I'm glad that everybody's a homer and you want to do that, but the Indiana basketball they remember isn't the Indiana basketball. Now, it's like saying, I know Indiana high school basketball because I watched the movie Hoosiers. It would be interesting. I'm sure we could go around over many cold beverages and do this, but I hope that they give him a chance. Archie Miller is a fantastic young coach. And some of these other guys that are moving, I mean, they're moving for the right reasons and trying to get there. You look at Will Wade moving from the A-10 to LSU. He's going to face the same thing. So you've lost two of those. Another interesting hire is Kevin Keith, who had UNC Wilmington in the dance again. He's going to take over for Mark Gottfried at North Carolina State. And, of course, we'll have to talk at another time about the fact that the Winthrop coach agreed to go to Massachusetts and then backed out as he was about to be introduced. So more on the coaching carousel as we go. Lots of interesting things going on. But now we sort of know who's staying put and who's not. And also a couple programs have lost some key assistants. Baker Dunleavy has left the Nova staff to take over as Quinnipiac. And like you said, Mike Hopkins going to Syracuse to Washington, and Cal elevating their assistant, Wyking Jones, to their head job. So lots of fun things, and we don't want that to go. There'll be more talk. They'll kind of put a moratorium on that as people get through the Final Four here, and then it'll go straight into recruiting season. But we want to wish all four teams a fantastic time. As Jim has already said, we'll be talking about that fantastic Xavier run on our Razorcast this Thursday, so tune in for that. But as we head out, I'm sure Jim will have a couple more shots from Indiana, and then we'll go right into our trivia and tidbits.
Well, you bring the Pat Kelsey backing out of the UMass job. I will say I had a cold chill go down my back, but because here's what my thought was. I thought there's been some backroom discussions, and Mac really is going to go to Indiana, and Xavier had contacted him, and that's why he backed out. I thought, because, Pat Kelsey's from Cincinnati and actually coached at Xavier before he took over the Winthrop job. So I'm glad that didn't happen. And Matt, we'll leave the Indiana discussion for next year.
Well, as we could about Chris Mack shooting, it seems like he's staying. We'll talk about what he's got to look forward to with that squad as it goes. Well, as I know you always do, you'll have something here for me to ruminate on. So go ahead with your trivia.
Well, I got one real quick one from here since you brought up the major NCAA basketball power, Quinnipiac. Do you even know where Quinnipiac is?
Connecticut.
Do you know what their mascot is?
Shoot. I did because I had a couple kids from Japan go there. But you caught me off guard. What is their mascot?
The Bobcat. Now, I'll be honest with you. I just Googled that, so I didn't know that either.
Great name, though. Quinnipiac. Just the way
Pontiac. Took me
spelled,
years.
just like it sounds.
Yeah, it took me years. How do you pronounce that? All right, you ready for your just one today, Jeff? This is a one and done.
Oh, it's not going to be a parfait. Okay, must be a real sinker then, huh?
You'll have to think, but you probably have a good guess anyway. I don't think it's not one of those, that I dug out of the bottom of the barrel after digging for a couple of days. But here we go. Name the Cinderella team in the NCAA tournament who won it all that had the lowest regular season ranking of any team that won it.
Ooh. My first guess, because I know they were one of the lowest seeds to win it, would be Jim Valvano's North Carolina State team.
You are correct. You nailed it. Jeff Zink, you're getting better and better as the year goes on. Summer.
All depends upon how much time you have to dig into the archives. That's what gets me. Like I said, it was just a one. We've gone back to what we were at the beginning here, a trivia question rather than having to get through a labyrinth to catch the mouse with the cheese and not the cat with the fish. But anyway, that's great. I remember they were the lowest ranked, and they almost didn't. Kind of like Xavier being the last team announced before the Final Four. North Carolina State wasn't even sure they were going to make that. They had to win. And most people don't remember this. They actually won the ACC tournament to get in. Otherwise,
they weren't going to get in that large. They had gone on a losing streak because of what was his name was hurt for a while.
Yeah, great. And then another one of those great 30-30s if you ever get a chance to watch it.
My favorite.
We got some fun trivia and tidbits here, and again, be with us next Tuesday. Enjoy the weekend of basketball, and we'll be able to wrap up the tournament on Tuesday. A couple of fun things that I found that's going through this week. It was 100 years ago this week that the Stanley Cup in hockey was won by the first U.S.-based team. Any idea who that was, Jim?
I would have to guess the New York Rangers.
Yeah, bit of a trick question because it was the Seattle Metropolitans.
Oh, yeah, I got that.
Yeah, the Cup in those pre-NHL, the NHL was only founded, their first season would have been 100 years ago this fall. It was an end-of-season series between the Pacific Coast Hockey Association winner and the National Hockey Association winner. That year it was the Montreal Canadiens. But some nice hockey history involved were some of their biggest names. The Patrick brothers, Frank and Lester, they used to name the divisions. There was the old Patrick division that was named for them. And those two brothers formed the Metropolitans. And in the net for Montreal was George Vezina, and that's the name that goes on the trophy for the NHL's top goalie each season. So those two leagues merged that fall and became the NHL, but the Metropolitans left after about 5 years. And 40 years ago today, Rocky wins the Best Picture at the Academy Awards, another sports-related tidbit. But here's the fun one. It was 25 years ago yesterday that one of the most fun movies associated with basketball premiered as Rosie Perez, Wesley Snipes, and Woody Harrelson opened in White Man Can't Jump. Ron Shelton, who was in sports, who's made his name with baseball with Bull Durham and golf with Tin Cup, was the director. And this is lots of fun basketball movies. Less than a year after the even more quirky The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh debuted. But it was 12 years before Blue Chips and 14 years before Eddie, 16 years before He Got Game, 18 years before Love and Basketball. And luckily got the taste out of people's mouths because it was 5 years after One-on-One, with Robbie Benson pretending to be a NCAA basketball player. And I didn't even mention your favorite, I'm sure, in there, which is Hoosiers. And I just mentioned this in case that loved one in your life says, why don't we see a movie instead of watching basketball? There's a whole slate of nice basketball movies that you can have to keep her at bay or him or whoever it might be. Okay, so that's it for today. Have fun this weekend. Saturday's games. Sit down with your favorite cold beverage and a group of friends and watch. And then Monday night is the championship from Glendale Arizona, just outside of Phoenix. And then we will be back on Tuesday to talk all about it. So until then, enjoy your basketball, and we'll see you on Thursday for the Razorcast.